Contrast this kind of certainty and forward thinking on trade with that of the last 4 years, where the only certainty was that you were going to lose ground because your government fundamentally rejected free markets, free enterprise, and free trade. The last administration turned to industrial policy because it was certain that the free market failed in delivering what government planners believed was necessary for climate and social agendas. Indeed, China's central planners saw their own strategic thinking in the Inflation Reduction Act's approach of bestowing massive subsidies to stimulate investments that the market would not. We can restore faith in free markets by making it easier than ever to do business in America. The President's executive order last week to assist major investors to navigate our regulatory system efficiently is a good start. We plan to do more. The Biden administration provided us with only the certainty that in the face of a foreign government's discriminatory policies like digital service taxes, data localization, or other non-tariff barriers, it would not stand up for its citizens because it believed that the so-called right to regulate trumped the principle of free enterprise. Respectfully, democratic governments do not have rights. They exist to secure rights for their citizens. One immediately welcome change under the Trump administration appeared last week in the USTR's National Trade Estimate. Last year, the Biden administration deliberately cut from the estimate a number of discriminatory measures imposed on America by foreign governments because it sided with those governments over our citizens. This year's estimate is exhaustive because the administration carefully identified all of the ways that Americans lose out in the global marketplace. Finally, the validity of free trade will be seen again. The last administration did not pursue market access in its negotiations. Instead, it demanded governments to undertake a number of social and environmental commitments, even ones Congress did not approve of domestically. Not surprisingly, our partners did not put their trust in such negotiations. While tariffs inherently may be seen at odds with free trade, we must also acknowledge that many of our trading partners deploy barriers that have gone unchallenged for too long. Free trade, by definition, must be reciprocal. We do not have it if others can impose barriers on us unchallenged. Our failure to enforce our rights over the last 4 years lost a lot of ground for us. This cannot continue because what I am certain about is that American goods and services are innovative, high quality, and globally competitive. Senior administration officials say that a number of countries are coming to the table to engage with the USTR. We look forward to hearing about this engagement and the steps toward better opportunities for Americans.
Thank you. Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee, I appreciate you taking the time today for this hearing. Last Wednesday, President Trump declared a national emergency in response to the large and persistent trade deficit that has built up in recent years. This deficit is driven in part by non-reciprocal tariffs, trading barriers, and other economic policies pursued by our foreign trading partners. The situation is urgent. President Trump imposed tariffs to address this emergency, and these measures are aimed squarely at achieving reciprocity and reducing our massive trade deficit to reshore production in the United States. This national emergency declaration and tariff action is the most significant change in U.S. trade policy since we allowed China to join the World Trade Organization. The American working class, in particular, has suffered concentrated losses from the so-called China shock and other adverse effects of past trade policy and the conditions that give rise to this massive trade deficit. You've heard some of these numbers before. The United States has lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and 90,000 factories since 1994. President Biden left with a $1.2 trillion trade deficit in goods, the largest of any country in the history of the world. The United States' share of world manufacturing output declined from 2001 to last year. In the fourth quarter of 2024, U.S. manufacturing as a share of gross domestic product was the lowest it had been in 20 years. During COVID, we were unable to procure semiconductors to build our cars, or materials for pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment. During World War II, we built nearly 9,000 ships. Last year, the United States built only 3 ocean-going vessels. Our agricultural trade balance, which historically resulted in trade surpluses for our farmers, was in deficit the last 2 years of the Biden administration and likely will take some time to recover. These are all serious indicators of an economic and national security emergency, and we can't ignore it. One important driver of these negative trends has been unfair, unbalanced, and non-reciprocal trade. This includes the effect of higher tariffs imposed by other countries on the United States, the effect of non-tariff measures that promote other countries' exports and obstruct U.S. exports, and other foreign economic policies favoring overproduction and degrading America's manufacturing capacity. And the lack of reciprocity is an important driver of our global trade deficit and with particular countries. So it's common sense to focus on these indicators. For example, the European Union can sell us all the shellfish they want, but the EU bans shellfish from 48 states. The result is a trade deficit in shellfish with the EU. We only charge a 2.5% tariff on ethanol, but Brazil charges us an 18% tariff. The result? We have a large trade deficit in ethanol with Brazil. Our average tariff on agricultural goods is 5%, but India's average tariff is 39%. You understand the trend here. Our trade deficit, driven by these non-reciprocal conditions, is a manifestation of the loss of the nation's ability to make, to grow, to build. And the president recognizes the urgency of the moment. On the first day of his second term, President Trump issued a comprehensive memorandum setting out his trade policy directive. And over the past 10 weeks, he has executed on nearly all of these priorities. He has tightened tariffs on steel and aluminum. He's imposed new measures on auto and auto parts not made in the United States. And on April 2nd, the president declared the national emergency that we've discussed. And so the president has imposed a reciprocal tariff along with a global baseline tariff to achieve reciprocity with other countries and to drive the dangerous deficit down. And the president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Over the past few weeks, a planned layoff for an auto production shift in Tennessee has been suspended. Another automaker is hiring additional employees and expanding overtime to increase auto production in Indiana. Companies have announced $4 trillion in new investment in the United States. Nearly 50 countries have approached me personally to discuss the president's new policy and explore how to achieve reciprocity, and they've spoken with many members of the administration. Several of these countries, such as Argentina, Vietnam, India, and Israel, have suggested that they will reduce their tariffs and non-tariff barriers in line with the president's policy. And these obviously are welcome moves. Our large and persistent trade deficit has been over 30 years in the making, and it will not be resolved overnight, but all of this is in the right direction, particularly as we start to negotiate with these countries. We must move away from an economy that's based solely on government spending and the financial sector, and we must become an economy based on producing real goods and services that provide jobs for working class and middle class Americans in their communities. This adjustment may be challenging at times, and in a moment of drastic overdue change, I'm confident, I'm certain that the American people can rise to the challenge as they've done before. I appreciate this committee's interest in President Trump's trade agenda. I'm glad we're talking about this. That's created debate. And we may not agree on everything, but I know that you want to do what's best for America. So does the president, and so do I, and we'll collaborate together on this. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yesterday, Secretary Bessent stated that you and he both will lead trade negotiations with Japan. I am very pleased that President Trump has decided to press for market access in this case. I hope we'll see more negotiations that press for zero-to-zero barriers, but could you explain a little bit what is the scope of these negotiations?
Certainly. Thank you, Chairman. So as you know, yesterday the President directed Secretary Bessent and myself to interact with the Japanese. We've already been having several conversations with them over past weeks. So this is not a new development, but we are taking it to a new level. Obviously, we want to have more market access in Japan. For us, we feel like we could have more and better agricultural market access. There are also structural impediments to some of our industrial goods in terms of standards and regulations and that kind of thing. I also think that there are things we can do with our trading partners, things that aren't always purely in the trade sector with respect to economic security, whether it's export controls alignment or investment screening alignment or energy, making sure that our partners are tied up with us with respect to liquefied natural gas and other resources, as opposed to being dependent on other countries that may not be as friendly. And so I think all of these factors will go into these discussions with Japan in the coming weeks.
Well, thank you. And as you indicated in your testimony, you've been approached, the administration or you have been approached by about 50 other countries already. I assume that the objective in the in these approaches, and I assume that there will be discussions and negotiations with them. But first, could you verify that? Is the objective here to engage in market access negotiations with these countries?
Chairman, as these countries approach us, the idea is that we've had years and years of non-reciprocal access, and it's contributed to these trade deficits. As the countries come to approach us, what we've told them is, if you have a better idea to achieve reciprocity and to get our trade deficit down, we want to talk to you. We want to negotiate with you. And it goes both ways. Sometimes they have exports to us that are driven by subsidies and unfair trading practices. And then obviously they have non-reciprocal treatment on their end where they block our exports, sometimes through prohibitive tariffs, quotas that are not administered in the appropriate way, or other unfair trading practices. So these are the kinds of things that should be targeted. And I don't want to prejudge the negotiations, but if they're able to provide an alternative plan that can further these objectives, I think we're open to that.
Well, thank you. The America First Trade Policy Memorandum rightly tasked the USTR to review China's compliance with the Phase 1 agreement. Under the agreement, China is obligated to purchase more U.S. goods and change basic practices and laws, the so-called structural commitments. The prior administration refused to discuss whether China complied with its structural commitments. And by the way, these were commitments made in response to tariffs in President Trump's first presidency, correct?
That's right.
What is your analysis of China's compliance with the structural commitments that it made in Phase 1 so far?
Our assessment, Chairman, is that in the initial stages of implementing the agreement, China made significant movement to make these structural changes, whether it was with respect to agricultural rules, financial services, or IP. We found during the Biden administration there was little enforcement and little communication, and that the Chinese did not comply with this agreement in large part. I've had a call with my counterpart. I've communicated to him our feeling on this, that they have not complied with the agreement. And I think we're disappointed by this. It's not surprising, but we are certainly disappointed by that.
And now you're engaged to, again, see if we can get compliance.
We will see, right? The Chinese obviously have agency in this. It's not just a matter of U.S. policy. We, of course, welcome and we hope that foreign countries will change their practices to make sure that they're fair, and we look forward to continuing to monitor that situation.
Thank you. The administration has announced it's negotiating an agreement also with India, and it appears already to be yielding results, such as India dropping its digital services tax. Although India has high tariffs, its non-tariff barriers are just as significant, if not more so. Will you try to include commitments on matters such as intellectual property, technical barriers to trade, and science-based agricultural rules to take on those barriers?
Yes, and I have a standing call with my Indian counterpart to address these very issues.
Ambassador Greer, well, thank you for being here today. I know there's been a lot of discussion about tariffs, but would you just briefly discuss non-tariff barriers to trade? In other words, the barriers that countries put up to deny market access from U.S. exports into those countries that aren't tariffs per se.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I have here in my hand a book that's become very popular in recent days. This is the National Trade Estimate on Foreign Trade Barriers, and the Office of the United States Trade Representative puts this together with input from civil society, unions, industry, business, small business, and this is 400 pages of all the non-tariff barriers that you're talking about. Just a few examples. India, huge trading partner, they restrict imports of ethanol for fuel use by using restrictive import licenses. These are the types of border measures that don't sound very sexy to talk about, and they don't make for a great soundbite, but these are the things that actually block our exports, where they have licensing regimes or they have fake science that they use to block our imports.
Lynn, just one example that seems to me to make the point is that our friends in Australia basically have put up barriers to the export of beef from the United States. My state, Texas, happens to produce a lot of beef cattle, and Australia basically denies access to its huge market, but not as a result of tariffs so much as non-tariff barriers to trade. Could you speak to that?
Yes, Senator, and it's always surprising because we have a free trade agreement with Australia, and we would expect that we would have fair and reciprocal trade. Last year, I think we imported about $3 billion worth of Australian beef, and we exported $0 of American beef to Australia. And it's not just beef. Australia also blocks on species, fake science grounds, the export of fresh and frozen U.S. pork. So it's incredible that they do this. We have zero exports of the fresh and frozen U.S. pork to Australia.
I find it interesting that people express surprise at President Trump's policies when he's been talking about these policies for, best I can tell, for decades, and how unfair trading arrangements are between various countries. And indeed, some of these unfair trading practices have resulted in the deindustrialization of America. We've exported manufacturing to Asia, and particularly China and other countries, that now appear to be willing to hold us hostage to those supply chains. A few years ago, we passed the Chips and Science Act. We worked with Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Ross during President Trump's first administration, and later was signed by President Biden, but to bring advanced semiconductor manufacturing back on shore, because we recognized that the vulnerability that existed if there was another pandemic, there's a natural disaster, or heaven forbid, a military conflict break out in Asia, we wouldn't have access to these advanced semiconductors that run everything from your cell phone to the avionics on an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. But China has basically held us hostage and continues to use some of these vulnerabilities to our detriment. For example, critical mineral processing. Would you speak to the vulnerability that exists as a result of China basically processing 90% of the critical minerals in the world that are essential for our daily lives?
Yes, Senator, and that figure is always one that gives me great concern, the 90% of the processing. We do have critical minerals in the United States. We have lithium here. We have other critical minerals here. And a lot of it is that China has centralized the processing of minerals, right? We have in the Western Hemisphere, in Bolivia, in Chile, we have all kinds of critical minerals, and that's in our hemisphere. But they get sent to China, they're processed, and they come here, and then if China wants to exercise economic coercion or other practices, they do have a stranglehold on these kinds of things. That's a very dangerous situation to be in. I mean, this is part of the urgency of what we're talking about. And I think as the Trump administration certainly takes action on trade, but also takes action on the environmental side and permitting and regulation, that's an area where we can actually have more of that activity here in the United States, or we can work with our trading partners to try to incentivize production there as well.
When I speak to my rice people and my shrimp people back home, they say that the tariff barriers and the subsidies by other countries for those products are so much that it is putting some of our shrimpers and some of our rice people either out of business or in incredible financial binds. And so the fact that the president is attempting to address these as well as the non-tariff trade barriers is incredibly important. Let me first say that. But I also hear from my producers that the mean tariff being selected to apply to a country may not account that for rice, for example, the tariff is much higher for that particular product, and that it is not adequate to address that which is taking place. Any thoughts on that, and how can we have something more particular for products which are really over-tariffed?
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate that concern, and the tariff rate applied to many of these countries, again, was a country-wide rate. It wasn't product-specific. My sense is if countries come to us and they expect to have some kind of a different plan, they will need to change these things, right? And they will have specific products, specific barriers that they would have to address. Right, or else, the president, again, he's fixed his purpose. He wants to see production back here. He wants to see our agriculture producers doing well. And these countries just have to have reciprocal trade with us. And that means taking care of the types of barriers and tariff rates you're talking about.
So it sounds like you, one of the things I think they want to know is that since shrimp might be a relatively small part of trades with some of these countries, that the interests of, for example, shrimp will not be sacrificed in part of a greater whole.
No, I think, and I saw a really interesting article today in the New York Times on shrimp. You may have seen that, where the tariffs have actually given a bit of a lifeline to these shrimpers. And I think that, if there's going to be any kind of change to any of this, and I'm not going to prejudge that, we have to make sure that our industries are protected adequately, so we don't go backwards with the deficit.
Let me ask, in the President's America First trading policy, there's several sections relating to free trade agreements and how they will be evaluated. Senator Bennett and I are working on an Americas Act, which would be a hemispheric trade policy, which would have several purposes. One, to strengthen those ties. Secondly, to keep the Chinese from making the incursions that they are absolutely making throughout the hemisphere. Some are calling the Caribbean a Chinese lake. And so this would allow us to push back upon that. Can you share anything regarding the analyses of the free trade agreements we have within our hemisphere, and then specifically on countries like Argentina who would like an FTA with our country?
Certainly. I would say that we are first and foremost focused on addressing this emergency and the reciprocal tariff action and implementing it appropriately. With respect to relations in the hemisphere, any kind of trade arrangements with these trading partners, I think, need to be coupled with strong rules about third countries. What I don't want is a situation where these countries are using, their export platforms to incorporate content and goods from, China or other Asian countries, where we have a real issue with our deficit and offshoring of manufacturing. I would expect any kind of changes to these arrangements to be accompanied by changes in rules of origin to ensure that the United States and U.S. workers are really benefiting from these agreements.
So nothing from an FTA in general, but the specific of where it's being used to circumvent the intent of the FTA is the concern of the administration.
Yes, that's certainly a huge concern. And again, the president wants to see factories back here. The most certain way to not have a tariff is to build your factory in the United States. If people want to use other countries and insist on that, then we want to make sure that they're not using that to arbitrage for higher tariff jurisdictions to use them as an unfair export platform.
Let me ask you this. Louisiana has some of the largest ports in the nation by tonnage. And all the commodities going from the Midwest flow through my state going out to the world. Earlier, USTR proposed imposing like $1 million for every vessel built in China. And I'm told that if the Koreans have a fleet of 50 and 5 of the ships are built in China, then the $1 million would apply to all 50, not just to the ships that are built in China. Now, that would clearly impact a ship coming to the United States to offload. If you will, impact my ports and the ability of our goods throughout the nation to move through the Mississippi. Is USTR going to hang by that or considering modifying that? Can you kind of give us any idea about that?
So to address the lack of shipbuilding in the United States, USTR's proposed actions are just those. They're proposed actions. They're a series of potential remedies that could be used to incentivize shipbuilding in the U.S. They're not all going to be implemented. They're not all going to be stacked. We've asked for a lot of input, and we've had hearing on that. We've collected comments. We've reviewed it. I've met personally with certain stakeholders during that time period, and I think the president will look very carefully to make sure that we have the right amount of time and the right incentives to create shipbuilding here without impacting our commodity exports.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. I know you have had a busy week, and we appreciate that and appreciate what the president is trying to do for the broader economy. And, of course, it is encouraging to hear that we have 70 countries that are coming in to negotiate tariffs, and some of those non-tariff barriers that have existed. So we're grateful for all that work. I do want to ask you about some of the foreign governments using bogus environmental regulations to really sideline American businesses. And the EU's new deforestation regulation is a great example of this, imposing excessive reporting requirements that would shut out Tennessee pulp and paper producers from foreign markets. And also, we're seeing some of these foreign governments actually seize U.S. assets under false pretenses. And last year we had a company, Vulcan Materials, which declined to sell its Mexican port to the government. So armed forces came in and took control of that, citing environmental licensing requirements. And this is a pattern of regulatory abuse, and it keeps our companies out of the global market. So how are you working to protect these U.S. businesses and to deal with these foreign governments who are weaponizing their bogus regulations to restrict the market access?
Well, Senator, I always find it troubling when countries use these kind of measures as a protectionist measure. Our companies, whether they're making here and exporting or going elsewhere to produce in other countries, are always the cleanest and most responsible, always. And we should always have the best treatment under those kinds of regimes. So with respect to the two examples you noted on the Vulcan issue, I've raised this personally with Mexican trade officials. And with respect to the EU forestry regulation, my understanding is right now it's a little bit on pause while they themselves look at it and take a second look. And I talk to my counterparts in Europe frequently, and this is something where I want to make sure that they're treating us appropriately under this law, not discriminating against us.
That's wonderful. If I could get in writing from you an update on the Vulcan port issue, that would be helpful also.
We're happy to do that, Senator.
Thank
Yes.
you. I want to talk about digital trade because President Trump really has shown great leadership when it comes to digital trade. And that was a part of the negotiations on the USMCA. And it really gave us a very robust and ambitious digital trade chapter. And the provisions, including cross-border data flows and data localization, are critical to facilitating strategic U.S. initiatives across a broad range of industries. And we have an opportunity now to build on this digital chapter. So, and I think that could really pave a way to add other provisions on critical issues such as AI, such as quantum computing that we are dealing with. So how could you use this digital trade chapter that we have in the USMCA to expand that globally as we look at negotiating new trade agreements?
Well, I think it's important to understand that our companies, our digital trade companies, are the most competitive in the world. They're the most effective in the world. And what we don't want is a situation where they are retaliated against or they're discriminated against such that their Chinese competitors actually take up market share. I mean, that would be a disastrous situation. And so as countries come to us and want to talk about how to have more reciprocal trade or better trade actions, I would expect that we want to make sure that they're not discriminating against our technology companies. And we want to make sure we have a level playing field so we can have the appropriate market access that we want, and whether we do that in formal trade agreements or just in commitments from these other countries.
Well, and as you know, digital trade is important to Tennessee.
Yes,
so we're looking forward to that. Non-tariff barriers are something that get mentioned quite a bit as we are talking to companies. I know Vietnam has several non-tariff barriers, and we've seen this in the USTR's National Trade Estimate report. And we had a record high deficit with Vietnam in 2024. And in part, that's because Chinese companies are using Vietnam to transship. So will you work to ensure that any possible deal with Vietnam, because I know they've been first to the table to try to negotiate for a zero tariff, but we want to make certain that whatever is done includes provisions that will not allow China to reap the benefits of working with and shipping through Vietnam.
I agree with you 100%, Senator, whether it's Vietnam or others. If they think they're going to have some kind of different rate, it can't be one that gives preference to a third country like China, where they can just take advantage of it or use it to circumvent what we're trying to do. I agree with you 100%.